The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome. I'm David Brown, Director of Executive Education at Imperial College Business School. I'm delighted to introduce you to the latest in the Imperial Future Matters series. In this series, we're exploring some of the best thinking and practice from Imperial that may be helpful and important to leaders and organizations. We're intending for these to be topical as well as enduring, insightful and immediately useful. Indeed, much of the content is more fully explored in our open enrollment programs, many of which are online and highly interactive, and within our custom programs, both online and soon to be in person. We're about to explore a hugely important topic. It's just not enough to get through this crisis. We are seeing even more clearly the challenges in how we organize and lead. And many organizations are applying 19th century solutions to 21st century problems. And I'm really pleased to say that Imperial is thinking through and applying innovative solutions to many areas: drug and vaccine discovery for sure, medical practice, technology, how students and executives learn, and of course, management. I'm therefore truly delighted to introduce my friend and longtime colleague, Adam Kingl. Adam is an author and has just published a terrific book called Next Generation Leadership: How to Ensure Young Talent Will Thrive in Your Organization, available in all good on and offline bookstores. As well as an author, Adam is a brilliant educator and facilitator, and I'm delighted he's part of our Imperial Future Matters series. Adam, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Imperial, for hosting me and for the opportunity to share some thinking with all of you today. This is quite a big topic, isn't it? The evolution of capitalism. But really what I'm talking about is actually quite intimate. How do we practice work, right? How do we do this thing called work and live work life in a way that's not just more fulfilling, but maybe more beneficial for our economies? We saw lots of trends in the Great Recession of a little over 10 years ago, as well as right now, where I think a lot of organizations are truly reflecting and thinking about how do we have to reinvent the way we practice this thing called work. Now, let's talk a little bit about capitalism. What I would just add is a disclaimer, which is this: capitalism is not one thing. And number two, the way that capitalism evolves is quite elastic. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the world and we look at how capitalism is practiced, for example, in Scandinavia, particularly how they came out of the Great Recession, what they're doing now, it feels quite different, right? For how at New Zealand, I would add to that as well, is similar to Scandinavian capitalism, but it's quite different from how we practice capitalism, for example, in some of the Anglo-Saxon economies, which is again different from how, for example, you see capitalism practiced in Singapore, right? And in that tiny nation state, even though it looks like free and open capitalist society, you also see the hand of the state involved in many organizations. And I'm not making a value judgment there, but it is certainly practiced differently. And of course, I don't think there's an irony lost on any of us when we consider the largest capitalist economy in the world is controlled by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So capitalism is surely not one thing. But I know one thing for sure in speaking with companies all over the world, East, West, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, is that there is a hue and cry for the way in which we do work to evolve. Part of that is because we're losing our humanity in our work. And this is not new. This is something that we've been talking about for long periods of time, but it's in moments like this, right now, where we really are considering and looking at what could we do different. And that can accelerate the evolution of how we practice our world of work. Now, is there a time when humanity was more at the forefront of all sectors of society? Was there a time, could we look back at history and see where, for example, we could see a facile interplay between the estates of commerce and the arts and science and technology? Well, I think we can, and maybe there's some lessons to be learned there. And that's in the Renaissance, which I also call the first human revolution. We know that every human being on the planet has an abundance of the qualities of innovation or creativity, adaptability, inspiration. We all have it. And it stands to reason that when we come together in these communities that we call work, there should be a multiplier effect on those qualities. And yet it seems that our collective efforts produce a deficit of those qualities. In other words, our organizations tend to drain those very human characteristics. Why? Well, I think it's because we're burdened by some underlying assumptions of how we're supposed to organize effort. Assumptions that are, for the most part, as David alluded to, at least 150 years old, and we're fit for purpose for another age. Let's just look a little more carefully at the Renaissance, or excuse me, for those in Britain, the Renaissance. You have to excuse my accent. I was born in Milwaukee, so it's. And by the way, for those of you who are fans of Love Actually, that is not an accurate depiction of Milwaukee. Okay, I just needed to get that out of my system. But okay, Florence, 15th century, dusk. Lorenzo de' Medici, self-deprecatingly known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, is the ruler of the Florentine city-state, and he transformed the economy from wool production to modern banking. That's where the way in which we still practice banking was still largely created. This is the Medici Bank in Florence, still standing. And he and merchants like him sponsored a flowering of art, culture, education. I think this was undoubtedly one of the most profoundly important periods of societal development in human history. We had business and science and the arts intermingling in this synergy that benefited each estate and represented a new mindset. And artists were energized by this new curiosity, and that created new studies in anatomy and metaphor and narrative and even natural science, which fostered opportunities for inventors and merchants in universities. In other words, the arts not only benefited from economic prosperity, artistic endeavor contributed to it. Medici sponsored, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, among many others, and Leonardo invented the helicopter centuries before we saw it in reality. You can see there, he also made his notations in backward script that you had to read through a mirror because, creatives. But a few years later, Galileo championed heliocentrism and invented the thermometer and revealed Venus's moons. And that is not a euphemism. And Shakespeare, right on this side of the pond, explored the human condition. The layperson's excavation of the soul, occurring in London's Globe Theatre by this dapper gent, who looked at leadership and what it is to lead by kings who are granted divinity but cannot grasp it. I think about as Richard II, who chides, "You have mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel, want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king?" But we then fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, but the pastoral life was overcome by the satanic mills. And in humankind's quest to perfect the process by which we create wealth, that previous menage a trois between science, business, and the arts became a cozier domestic arrangement between just science and commerce, elbowing the arts into the periphery. And then we had a paucity of innovation and inspiration in relation to all of these human qualities that we still experience today as a deficit. And that's at least partially a symptom of the Industrial Revolution, which perfected the philosophy of this gentleman, Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management. Notice that's scientific management, not artistic management. His hypothesis is that the way that we organize business is to drive efficiency in and variance out, implying that a laborer is but a cog in a machine. Taylorism was specifically perfect for the manufacturing heyday of 100 plus years ago, when Henry Ford famously quipped, "Why is it every time I hire a pair of hands, a brain comes attached?" And over a short amount of time, this starscape of business lost its constellation of human and artistic exploration, a critical mindset laid to waste. We dehumanized our companies, yet today we lament that we lack humanity in our work life. Why are we surprised? Even with the digital revolution, that exploded the assumption on which we only sell physical goods and services as the way in which we practice capitalism. We didn't significantly change the way in which we managed our enterprises, and we still find company life inhuman. So, you know, we see, and what does that mean in terms of the symptoms that we face as an organization? Well, we have a major engagement crisis. This was a recent Gallup survey. I'm sure many of you are probably aware of the famous Gallup surveys that occurs about every other year. And they ask over 100,000 full-time employees in over 100 different countries and industries. They ask, are you engaged at work? And look at this most recent survey result. Only 13% reported that they're engaged at work. And this after the nirvana that was supposed to be the information age, right? The revolution of entrepreneurial spirit. Sometimes the scale of the problem isn't appreciated until we fully visualize it. Let's just picture it this way. Let's say you've got 100 people in your company. There they are, 100 people. And you ask, who is actively engaged in this organization? And if you are, paint yourself green. And this would be the reply. I mean, that's pathetic. That's a disgusting result. You know, and look at this, another bigger group, 24%, say they are actively disengaged. So they are dissing their companies. They would sabotage them given half a chance. And then you've got the 63% who really don't care, but they show up to work and they sleepwalk through their days. Now, what do we think about this? Well, you know, what's kind of amazing is that we typically look at this and we just kind of shrug resignedly and go kind of, well, like there's nothing we can do about it. By the way, Gallup also reported that only 9% of organizations are actively prepared to address this engagement crisis. In other words, most organizations waste more human capacity than they use, and they don't have the will to do anything about it. This waste of human potential is unconscionable. The lack of human beings giving discretionary effort to their organizations is terrible. And some leaders, I think, are starting to look at fundamental change, but it's happening far too slowly. This result, this is so funny, and only in business do you get these kinds of results, right? If you had this survey result in another industry, like teaching or medicine, this would be utterly unacceptable, right? For example, let's say we had a teaching convention. So we got all these teachers together, say primary school teachers. You got them all together and you said, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've done a survey of the students and their families, and this is what we learned. After the end of the academic year, 13% of students said that they learned more. 24% got stupider. Don't ask me how, I don't know how that happened, but that happened. And 63% reported no change one way or the other. Those teachers would be up in arms. They would be saying, we have to fundamentally reinvent the way that we do our jobs. Yet in corporate life, again, we shrug resignedly. Or imagine like if we were doctors in a hospital, we got everyone together, said, well, we surveyed all the patients and their families, and we saw that 13% of our patients got better, 24% died, 63% made no difference whatsoever. That would be a terrible result, right? And again, we would be looking at a much more fundamental discussion. So we just have to start having that fundamental discussion right now in our corporate life, particularly when we're immersed in this COVID crisis, right? Which is forcing us to reflect on so many things: the nature of life, the nature of work life, the nature of careers. And look, I'm not saying that there are elements of management and management science that we simply erase. We need some control in management, but what's the right balance? Because similarly, we know we need more innovation and engagement and adaptability in our organizations. Is the balance right? Are we spending enough time thinking about how we drive innovation and adaptability into the warp and weft of our corporate fabric? I think you'd agree with me that we're not. So, as a result of this, I started doing some research. Way back 10 years ago, started doing research, thinking about, well, what will the future of work hold? What could the future of work hold? And I started surveying high potential Gen Ys or millennials. Now, they weren't hyposed by my judgment or by the school I was working for. It's by their companies, their employers' judgment, saying these are our leaders of the future. These people will be joining our C-suite in the near future. They were all Gen Ys, so in their 20s and 30s. And I wanted to get a sense if their engagement is so low, if they are changing jobs with such frightening rapidity, and I think we all observe that, right? In fact, another question that I asked is how long they expect to stay with a given company, and over 90% said no more than 5 years, and over a third said no more than 2 years. So that leads to the question, so Gen Ys now compose 50% of the global workforce, and in 5 years' time, they'll be 75% of the global workforce. So it's critical for us to understand what they seek from work, from their employers. So I asked them the question. I gave them a multiple choice here. I said, choose your top 3 choices from among this list you see on your screen and rank them. So in other words, a response given as the number 1 most important factor was weighted more heavily than an answer given as number 2 or number 3. And you see, there's a huge variety of options here, tangible and intangible benefits, financial, reputational, etc. Let me just share with you what the top 3 responses were. The number 3 answer were development opportunities. This probably doesn't surprise you, but when I did follow-up interviews with dozens of these high potentials and their employers, what I learned is that your development doesn't have to be a promotion. That's the problem that a lot of companies face when they say, well, our young employees are always asking us for development, but the problem is we only have, say, 6 layers in our company. I can't promote someone every 8 to 9 months. That just doesn't work, right? There aren't enough rungs in the ladder, but that is not what they're asking for. What they're asking for is constant development, but that can take so many different forms. And in many cases, that can be inexpensive, if not completely free. So it might be a more senior project to give them. It might be a mentoring or reverse mentoring relationship. It might be a coaching relationship. It might be an international placement, etc. It's shadowing, you name it. There's so many different things where you can demonstrate to your employees that you are constantly developing them. Number 2 was organizational culture. And this is really the way in which we experience work on a micro level, the people we work with on a daily basis. So almost every interview that I had demonstrated that when we talk about culture, we don't mean employer value proposition. That's just too vague a term and a practice anymore. People want to know, who am I working with? How are we working together? Do I find that rewarding, personally and professionally? As a matter of fact, another question I asked is, what is the question you wish all potential employers asked you when you're interviewing for a job? The number 1 answer was, I want to see who I'm going to work with if you hire me. I want to meet them. And back in the day, pre-COVID, pre-lockdown, I want to see where I'm going to work. In other words, kind of show me my desk so I see the environment. So in other words, their experience of work is so important. And that's on a micro level, at the team level, at the colleague level, not at this huge macro organizational reputational level. The number 1 answer that people said they were looking for from their employer is work-life balance. And I think if anything, COVID-19 is just putting that into stark relief, right? What does that mean? What does that look like? Because many companies pre-lockdown were saying, well, there's no way you can work from home. That would be completely, unacceptable. You won't be as productive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think we all know that lockdown is proving that that's a lie, right? That we're all getting really good about working from home. And there was some recent studies done here in the UK, even though they're only 3 months old, asking employers, are your people more productive, same, or less productive than pre-lockdown? And the majority of employers are reporting that their people are as productive or more productive than they were before. So we're not going to go back to the way it was in terms of how our balance of how much we work from home or work in an office. That's changed forever. COVID has only accelerated that. Even pre-lockdown, and if you look at North America and Europe, 40 to 50% of us worked from home at least part of the time. It's been predicted pre-lockdown that in 5 years, that will be 75% of us will be working from home at least part of the time. Well, I think that's not going to be 5 years now, right? That's going to be as of now, right? Even after lockdown, we're going to be most of us are going to be working from home at least part of the time. And employers are seeing that this is now feasible and possible. You see so many examples of this, right? You probably all saw that Twitter announced to their people, you can all continue just working from home indefinitely, even when lockdown ends. Google and Facebook told their people that they're now working on a 10-year plan by which by the end of in a decade's time, most of their workforce will be working from home. In the banking sector, Barclays, right, the CEO recently said he was wondering if they should be spending all that money on commercial real estate. implying that more people should be working flexibly, working from home, etc. Here in the city of London, Zurich Insurance a couple of years ago made most of their office open plan. So in other words, telling people if you need to come into the office, there's a desk for you, but if not, you don't have to. So we're seeing this this evolution in all kinds of sectors. But there's something even more important that we need to discuss in relation to work-life balance, and it's this. In my interviews with employers, HR departments, young employees, older employees, etc., what I found is that there's semantic discord between the generations when we say work-life balance. So in other words, why is work-life balance a charged topic sometimes? Why do we get kind of quickly emotional about it? Well, we don't mean the same thing when we use this term. So when Gen Ys or millennials talk about work-life balance, what I found is typically they mean that as a where statement. In other words, technology allows me to work wherever I wish, so why can't I? They're putting to lie the concept of FaceTime, not being able to leave the office until the boss does, etc. Okay. For older generations, when they hear work-life balance, they think of that as a when statement. In other words, oh, my team is asking for more work-life balance. They don't want to put in their hours. I paid my dues. Why don't they want to pay their dues? They're lazy. And it becomes this. And that's why Gen Y gets this reputation, unearned, by the way, for being lazy. That's just folly. That's false. But we're not talking about the same thing. And by the way, I was talking before about reverse mentoring. That's a great way to start to clear up these kinds of misunderstandings that hold us back in terms of how we might practice work in the future. Okay, I talked about this already. So, but we really need to reframe the career conversation too, right? It's not just promotion, it's got to be progression. It can't just be, we'll develop you as a reward for tenure. Like we'll send you on a development course after 10 years because that's the way we've always done it. It's got to be more meritocratic, and it's got to be on a constant basis. Because we know, particularly our younger employees know, that they will live for a very, very long time. At least 50% of babies born since 2007 in developed economies have at least a 50% chance of living to be over 100. Over 100. Now, this was also reported in a wonderful book by Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott called The 100-Year Life, and they said there are huge implications for that. For starters, we're not going to be able to afford to retire at 65 if we're going to live to be 105, right? What we probably will be able to do is retire at, say, 85. But now that changes how we think about careers. It means careers are not a three-stage concept anymore. It's not education, work, retire. It's going to be more, the membranes between those different stages will be more permeable. So people might, for example, if I'm going to work for 60 years, then I can educate, qualify, and be a lawyer for 30 years, then educate, qualify, and be a doctor for 30 years. That was never possible before. Now, depends on your personality and what you want out of life. That might be intriguing and exciting, or that might be depressing. I can't answer that for you, but that is the way that we're going, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, portfolio careers, moving in and out of employer, self-employed, entrepreneurial, charity, commercial sector, that kind of mobility from sector to sector, from function to function, will be much more will happen with much greater rapidity, much greater frequency, much greater volume. And that's kind of exciting to me. Of course, it's also will have to be so because pension plans ain't what they used to be, right? 40 years ago, most pensions were on a final salary or defined benefit scheme. Now, most of them are on a defined contribution scheme. So we've gone from final salary to a pot of money or investments that have to last you until you die. So surely, as people near retirement, they're making this equation, right? How many years do I not have to work and yet can live? Well, for most of us, that's not going to be at age 65 if we forecast that we're going to be alive until 105. So we have to think about what is the nature of a career. That definition should not be taken for granted. And if any of us are at sort of midlife, like me, as you can tell from the gray in my hair, or younger, you really need to be thinking about careers differently. So in this manner, work life, the way in which we do work, will be changing, is changing fundamentally. Of course, it also means you're going to have more generations in the workforce. So managing a multi-generational workforce is going to be absolutely critical competence for leaders in the near to medium future. Right. So I've talked about this, some of these takeaways for you. What it also means, of course, is you don't have lifers anymore, right? Most people are not joining a company saying, I'm going to be here until I retire. They're thinking in terms of a few years, a handful of years, maybe for some people a decade, but it's not for life. The kind of IBM company man concept is kind of no longer really a dominant paradigm. However, what also might be the case is you can encourage people to leave but come back. Unfortunately, we don't exit people particularly well, right? What too many companies do still is when you sort of quit, the company says, okay, give me your swipe card, we're canceling your email, and don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Instead, we should be thinking about how can we keep a relationship with you so that maybe you'll come back in 10 years' time with all this new experience as one of our customers, one of our clients. You'll be gaining leadership experience. You'll get all this management training, which, by the way, we didn't have to pay for. And all of a sudden, you come back and we get all the benefits of that. Professional services firms like McKinsey and Accenture are world-class at cultivating an alumni network. In other words, the network of their former colleagues. They even hold reunions, just like universities. To cultivate these relationships and say that they are for life. And then what you get is this fluidity where people join, leave, rejoin, maybe at a more senior position, and they are clients, they are net promoters when they're not working for those firms. That can be very, very powerful. But most companies don't do that. They sort of sever the relationship when the employee leaves. And then, of course, there's very little to no hope that that person is ever going to have any continuing ongoing relationship with those firms. So there is no question. Talent today is increasingly becoming less loyal, more mobile, less constrained, but they're also more connected globally, right? Digital technology allows that for us. It also means that because we are more connected, we're more aware of crises going on all over the world. The good news is that means we're more willing, for example, to contribute to charities halfway around the world, whereas 200 years ago, we probably wouldn't have even been aware of those things. We're more internationally mobile, right? More people are willing to consider that we should be working, could work in other countries. As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from the US, but I've lived in the UK now for almost half my life. I think digital technology contributed to that. But there are some upsides and downsides to that, right? I think our priorities, our values are changing. So let me just do a quick little exercise. Hopefully will be a bit of fun. If you go to the questions box on the far, should be for most of you on the right-hand corner. Can I just get everyone, just put in a one-word answer, fastest fingers first, don't think too hard about it. I just want to see a volume of answers. What's the one thing in your life that you cannot live without? Can you just start putting those in, one-word answers, please, as quick as you can? I just want to get a sense, right, from this audience, where are we at? And then I'll share some results from another survey. Family, husband, internet, family, again, sustainability, art. I love that. I love that answer. Relationships, gardening. Yeah, for many of us, I think that's gone right. Wine, gardening and wine, right? This is the state of our lives right now. I think we have just encapsulated COVID lockdown. One of the two most important things in your life, gardening, wine, friends, family, nature, family, beer, some books, travel, and cheese. I think those would definitely be in my top 5, travel and cheese. Purpose, that's a really good one. Free time, family. Okay, let me just share with you sport. Yeah, let me just share with you, for example, a survey that was done several years ago now, and it was a consumer survey asking people this same question that I've just asked you. Someone put cars. Okay, hold that thought. What can you not imagine life without? The number 4 answer was my partner or spouse. That was number 4. Number 4. Number 3 answer was my car. So if your spouse or partner is in the room where they're hearing this, maybe just mute right now and or tell them I don't agree with that at all. I don't that the car fares better than my partner. Number 2 was the internet. And I think you know where this is going, right? The number 1 answer, what can I not imagine life without, is my mobile phone. Good thing, bad thing, right? Who knows? but it does tell us a little bit about the age we live in. However, I was really intrigued how many of you put relationships, family, friends, partner in the chat box just now. And I think this is, again, partially an acceleration toward or a reminder of the importance of humanity, human connection because of COVID. So again, if we can't even say, and I don't mean to say this in any dismissive way, but if there can be a silver lining in this pandemic that we find ourselves in, maybe it's that. Maybe it's that. And maybe in company life, we'll remind ourselves of that, and we'll be heading more in those sorts of directions. Because even right now, we have malady in this terms of this relationship to our mobile phone instead of a human being. 53% of people in Britain suffer from nomophobia, genuine malady, just like arachnophobia, agoraphobia, xenophobia, you name it. All these things that are genuine fears that increase the cortisol levels in our body, genuine phobias. Nomophobia is the fear of not having phone signal or Wi-Fi. And you see this, right? Remember the time when we used to go to airports? We'd sit there, and for some reason, when everyone's in airport, it's very important that they have Wi-Fi signal. And you see that when someone's on their phone and they're trying to get onto their Wi-Fi and it's not working, and it inevitably is not working, right? And it's like they start shaking and looking up, trying to find where the signal could be. They get the sweats. They start looking for someone to complain to. After like 10 seconds, they only tried for 10 seconds. Well, that's because this is the age in which we live. So again, technology, good thing, bad thing. Certainly our people as employees, as people, as leaders have different expectations. We certainly work in more networked environments. We work in a decentralized manner. And there are different implications then for how our leaders need to behave, for the values and priorities that our leaders communicate. And so this was really kind of an interesting question I asked myself. So as I was nearing the end of my research for my book, Next Generation Leadership, which is this, that's what it looks like. Okay, there it was. I was asking, well, okay, if you Generation Y, have different views about work, life, careers, leadership, what kind of leader will you be? In other words, if your paradigms are different from other generations, maybe not completely different, but in some significant ways different, then will you eventually lead your organization in a significantly different way from those who came before you? And that's kind of interesting, right? Because then that gives us a view into what the future of work will hold for us, because we're simply asking our future leaders. And by the way, remember, the people I were interviewing and surveying was not a random selection of Gen Ys, right? I didn't go out onto the street and just find young people and say, what do you think about careers and work? I was asking people who already were selected by their companies to be their high potentials, our leaders of the future. And they came from 44 different countries. So this is not even a British-centric survey. Northern and Southern Hemisphere represented, East and West, you name it. And I asked them this question. What would be your focus if you were the leader of your organization? So what would be your mantra, the totem, the phrase or the thing that you will keep in your mind, in your head, as you go about leading your organization, no matter what that scale and scope might be? And I try to give them a wide variety of options here. So how business is trading, so kind of business fundamentals like same-store sales, market penetration, the basics. Global growth, right? We all aspire to be global, so global penetration, is that the most important thing for you? Or is it entrepreneurial? Right? Adaptable is a really important term that we hear more and more and more and more in business. So is it important to be entrepreneurial or intrapreneurial, and keep reminding the organization that they can't think about their value as just scale, but it also has to be resourcefulness and inventiveness and adaptability? Or is it renewing your personal mission and organizational mission? So articulating and living the purpose and values of your organization and reminding your own people as CEO, say, why you do what you do and why you are the person to be led by them. To quote Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones, the author of Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? What is it about you that will excite people to exceptional performance? Well, that has something to do with where you come from and your purpose. Or is it about maximizing the financial worth of the business, right? So a very Milton Friedman-esque view, right? It's about maximizing value to shareholders, for example, if you're a publicly traded company. All right, let me share with you the results. 11.5% of our high potential leaders, our young hypos, said 11.5% said how the business is trading. Again, only 11.5% said global growth. Now, a much bigger percent, a third, said it was about entrepreneurial perspective. And a whopping 43% said it's about renewing personal and organizational mission, i.e. it's all about purpose. Now, let me just pause for a second for you to do the math to see, because there's only one answer left. Have you added them up? Okay, good. Only 1% said it was about the financial worth of the business. So is this the end? Is this our doom? Is it the end of capitalism? Is it the end of businesses for profit? Are we relegated to a state of, just discussing our purpose and nothing more shall come of it as we slowly expire into extinction? Let me ask, I'm gonna launch a poll. It's gonna come up on your screen now on your toolbar. Does that result scare you? Just yes or no. Could you please just answer that question? Just click yes or no, simple as that. I wanna know what you think, this audience. Whatever your age is, whatever your professional background, we just learned that purpose and entrepreneurialism are much more important than financial worth for our CEOs of the future. So we're getting our results in. It seems we're at about 1/4 to 3/4. 1/4 are saying yes, it scares me, and about 3/4 are saying no, that doesn't scare me. That's kind of interesting. Still moving a little bit, still pretty dynamic. We're now at about 20% yes, 80% no. Fascinating. Okay, I think that's now stopping, so let me close that poll. So yeah, we're at 80-20, the 80-20 rule. 20% said yes, 80% said no. I think it's really appropriate and very timely that this result came out 80-20. Do you know where? Sorry, this is just a footnote, but this is fascinating. You know where the 80-20 rule came from? It came from an Italian economist and engineer named Pareto. So this is where we get the Pareto Principle. The Pareto Principle and the 80-20 rule are the same thing. And it was that Pareto, 100 years ago, or a little less than that, but he observed that in Italy, it seemed that 80% of the wealth in that country was owned or controlled by 20% of the population. That's kind of frightening, right? Disturbing. But you ain't seen nothing yet. Today, 50% of the world's wealth is controlled by 1% of the world's population. Now, don't get me wrong, ladies and gentlemen, I am not a communist. I work for business school here. But there is something wrong, perhaps, in the way in which we practice capitalism, particularly when we combine the field of sociology, which tells us that there are such vast inequities in our society, those societies become unstable. And surely the last month has told us that that is the case. Let me tell you why I'm an optimist about this result of 1% financial worth and 76% said it's about entrepreneurialism, adaptability, creativity, etc. I think we've crossed a meridian. A seismic shift has occurred and we're not going back. And that is that it's much more important that we connect with why we do what we do. In a way, this will be much more customer-centric. It'll be much more employee-centric. You see this in a wonderful book by the former CEO of HCL Technologies, an Indian tech company named Vineet Nayar, who wrote a book called Employees First, Customers Second. That's kind of interesting, but he's making the point that if you have engaged, purpose-driven employees, your customers benefit. And if your customers benefit and buy from you and buy more from you, then your shareholders benefit. So it actually creates a virtuous circle. What the Great Recession taught us over 10 years ago is that some companies were starting to get it wrong. In other words, they were trying to maximize their quarterly forecasts to please the analyst community. And as a result, they lost track of who they were serving and why they did what they did. The great example of that is Enron, right? Busted for financial manipulation because they completely lost the fact that they were an energy trading company. So how would they be a better energy trading company tomorrow than they were yesterday? Instead, they became a cook the books company. But we still see that today, right? Companies are saying, how do I get that P&L and that balance statement to show the best possible numbers I can on a quarterly basis? Well, first of all, if you're thinking quarterly, you can't possibly be thinking strategically, right? Think about how that retards innovation, long-term thinking, create a pipeline of research and development that might have a much longer time frame. You can't. You just can't. So you even have older CEOs like Paul Pullman, the former CEO and chairman of Unilever, who several years ago said, I'm not doing quarterly forecasts anymore for the analyst community. Tough, not doing it. And people asked him why. He said, because I can't think quarterly. I can't think strategically and quarterly at the same time. So it's also, think of it this way. We have to think much more about our outputs. And if we trust in doing our outputs brilliantly, then the outcomes more or less take care of themselves. The outputs are serving our customers better, finding unmet needs, serving those needs. Then the outcomes, revenue, profits, they occur, right? But if we're only focusing on the outcomes and ignoring the outputs, we start to lose innovation, customer centricity, entrepreneurial spirit, all these things that we are lacking. Now, look, I'm not saying that you don't have some of the governance and management controls in order to make sure that you remain profitable, right? Keeping control of your costs, your hiring, etc. But do we have the balance right? Where are we on that spectrum of outputs and outcomes? I think the balance is completely out of kilter. But here's the good news, is that more and more Gen Ys, who we know are much more oriented toward purpose-driven companies, they are becoming the heads of pension funds, mutual funds. They are joining the analyst community. They're leading the analysts and the research and development companies of banks. So they're looking for companies that are doing these things. So I don't think the markets and the analysts will be punishing companies for much longer for having the courage to think long-term and being purpose-driven. So for example, let me just share it, for a whole country that is changing its orientation. New Zealand have said that there are other indicators that we need to look at besides GDP growth to look at the health of our country. Their finance minister had this great, I'm not going to read it out for you, but you can see it there. It's a great quotation to say there's so many other factors that we need to consider to be a well society, right? It's not just about GDP growth, but we have to pay attention to those things and measure those things so that we can address those things. Another great piece of research was done over 10 years ago by the authors of the book Firms of Endearment, not Terms of Endearment, but Firms of Endearment, who looked at those companies who lived their values and purpose with sort of relentless energy, who were publicly traded, and they looked at how they performed against the S&P 500 and their industry competitors. And what they found is that those firms of endearment outcompeted the market by a factor of 10. So in other words, over 10 years, the return on those firms of endearment was 10 times that of their competitors who were also publicly traded or just investing in the S&P 500. That's a tremendous result. That tells us that we have to question that there is a trade-off between purpose, entrepreneurialism, customer centricity, and profitability and share price. That actually those things work in tandem, that it's not a zero-sum game. As if you're a pure investor, you see this too. So because I work for universities, my pension plan rests with USS, the University Superannuation Scheme. I think this is the biggest pension plan in the UK. And they have a bunch of different equity funds that you can invest in, other funds as well. But if you look at their equity funds here, from 2018 to 2019, you can see the performance of 3 funds: UK equity, global equity, and ethical equity. So those organizations that really focus on governance, environment, society, employees, triple bottom line, etc. Well, if I invested in UK equity at the beginning of 2018, over a year, I would have a 4% return on my investment. Modest, not horrible. If I invested in global equity, I'd be getting a 10% return. That's pretty good, right? If you're getting a 10% return on your pension plan year on year, you're cooking with gas. But look at the ethical equity fund, 15% return, 15%. Now, in the past, when people looked at ethical equity funds, I think they were making a trade-off decision in their head. They were saying, morally, I'm going to invest in ethical equity, and I am giving up a certain percent of ROI to do so. What this is telling us is that it is not a trade-off, that the two work hand in hand or can work hand in hand. That's incredibly powerful, but that is still not the way in which we typically reflect on how our capitalist society can evolve and emerge and grow. I think as a society, there's so much that COVID is teaching us in terms of where our priorities and values can be. And the funny thing is, the more we focus on those things, the more I think we can improve the wealth of our society as well. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. I did want to leave time for questions. So let me pause there, pass the chair to David, who'll curate some questions, and we can have hopefully a really rich discussion. Thank you all very much.
Adam, thank you so much for that. That was terrific. A tour de force of the last few hundred years, let alone the current challenges. So we had a chapters of questions here. So which is we'll have to figure out how we deal with that. But let us get started. So question here based on Jan Domain and a few others as well. You mentioned the meridian and that we're at a key turning point.
Yeah.
But are firms really incentivized to change? And particularly, how do we, so that's incentivized, and how do we manage that tension between short-term and long-term?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. That is kind of the fundamental question, right? I think that's what CEOs around the world are asking themselves. And remember, by the way, the caveat, which I said at the very beginning, is that capitalism is practiced differently in different regions and countries in the world. So people are at different stages in where they're going as a society and as a capitalist society. But this is why I think it's in companies' best interest to think along the lines of what we're discussing. One is that many companies still have not recovered from the lack of trust from consumers during the Great Recession. So how do they restore trust and reduce that consumer pressure and the generational expectations? Because of course, digital media is holding us to account, right? It's increasing transparency, increasing the rate of communication of when companies are holding themselves to account, doing good by their communities and not just by their shareholders. Two, I would say that investors are more interested in ESG improvement, CSR, so that as well is an incentive. Third, I think just companies have a fundamentally selfish desire to avoid being overly regulated. They want to retain their license to operate, right? So companies are saying, look, we won't survive unless we pay more attention to our people, our community, our purpose, our environment. And I would even say fourth, that increased attention on purpose and values will reinforce their employees' enthusiasm and commitment. And that can only be a good thing if as a leader you can say, I have more discretionary effort for my employees this year than I did last year. And that probably will have a lot more to do with the culture, the purpose, and the value that you contribute to your world. And that can be a huge, inimitable competitive advantage.
Okay, terrific, thank you. Now, two or three questions here are, and particularly sort of opposite compared to what's going on. Do some industries find it inherently easier to embrace purpose? And we perhaps compare, I don't know, anything from health to finance, perhaps. And
right.
How do we navigate that?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. Definitely. The long answer is that doesn't let anyone off the hook, right? So, so I mean, I have advised as a consultant and as a program director for executive education to a lot of banks, a lot of global brands, you all know them. And they're all grappling with these issues because even those financial institutions recognize that they don't have a choice but to be more oriented toward ESG priorities. This goes back to my point about license to operate. And so actually, you know, if we can even, as we demonstrated, the markets will reward them for that orientation. It's more about questioning and overcoming the assumptions that have maybe governed them for decades, if not centuries. Now, yes, it's easier for example, if you work in healthcare, or I used to work quite a bit in media, communications, entertainment industry, of course, you're going to think about your purpose and values, etc. But as I say, while they might be further along in their evolution, everyone needs to get on this path. If for no other reason, then we find that consumers, employees, and markets reward them for it.
Okay, thank you. So there's a lot of questions about how. And there's a very, very strong, I can see the questions here, a very strong sense of course. And you've got that 1% answer in terms of the priority. But where do I start? And particularly, if I have a whole leadership cadre, my whole leadership isn't interested in this stuff, is behaving in ways that are in contrast to this, do I have to leave? What can I do?
Yeah. Well, whether to leave or not is even a deeper question. I won't go there, but what I will say is what we're talking about is a fundamental movement. We're talking about a brush fire becoming a forest fire in a good way. And if you think about how all significant movements occur, they generally are not top down, they're bottom up. Look at what's going on right now, right? In our societies all over the world, the Black Lives Matter movement. Look at how we overcame slavery. Look at how we're still, battling to overcome all kinds of other biases, prejudices in our society. It starts bottom up. So what I encourage people to do is start just from what is within your authority and your sphere of influence. So if you're a team manager, start with your team. Don't worry about changing the whole organization. Start here. Then another team will see what your team is doing, will pick up on that energy, that positivity. They'll start adopting it. Another team picks it up, a department picks it up, a country picks it up. And then all of a sudden, the leadership team, even if this wasn't on their radar, kind of don't have a choice but to start to get on board with this train the organization is now on. So, I certainly think we can't be paralyzed by the frustration of saying, well, I can't change until my leader changes. We have a lot more ability, energy, and innovation than we give ourselves credit for, right? We shouldn't be waiting to have permission to work with our colleagues to create the work life that we think is worth living for.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Great question here from Berger Bant. Apologies if the pronunciation's not right. Could you comment on the role of women and female leadership on the qualities you've highlighted?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think you see a lot more of women in leadership positions are leading the way here. So I mentioned New Zealand, right? Look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand leading the way. If you think about COVID and societies who are more successfully helping their societies work through these terribly difficult times, I look at and compare and contrast Angela Merkel, for example, in Germany, versus other leaders further west, and you see that maybe there are some differences. Now, I can't possibly say all the fundamental reasons why that is, but I think that for too long we have given short shrift to our women leaders. That I think that there is much more of what I'm advocating for. I hear from women leaders. And so, I tend to actually pay more attention to them as a result, because not for any other reason, but there was some of those results, particularly at a country level, at a macroeconomic level, speak for themselves.
Okay, thank you. Building on this, in that vein, and a bit more recent, we're seeing a lot of research that the current crisis, which is both a health crisis and an economics crisis, is disproportionately affecting women in the workforce. It's disproportionately affecting some minority groups, and it's also going to be even more challenging for those firms that are in a less strong position. So, how do you sense that coming out of this, is this going to lead to an acceleration in these terrifically important things you've been talking about, or actually it's going to make it even harder to implement these things?
Yeah. Well, I think and hope that it will be easier to implement these things, because I think investors and communities and customers are keeping a weather eye on those firms and how they're reacting to the crisis. You see it, right? Even today, when some companies are laying off a bunch of people while still retaining the salaries and/or roles of their leaders, that just goes like wildfire through social media. Consumers saying, "I will no longer buy from that company again." So look, we don't live anymore in a world where companies can do that and not be put under the microscope for their behaviors. So if companies are going out of business, and unfortunately, I think that is some of the reality of what we're facing, but some of them might go out of business because they reacted wrongly to the crisis instead of doing the right thing. Some maybe for inevitable economic reasons, but others because we as a society will punish them for not evolving in the way that we expect ourselves to behave as human beings.
Okay, thank you. Staying topical on this, question from Jürgen Husterman here, which is, you've focused on Gen Y. How are Gen Zs?
Yes.
Those born in '97, and we've seen what a critical and important and valuable role they played. Whether you're a leading footballer or closely involved with the BLM movement, then how are the Gen Zs going to this play out?
I'm so optimistic about the prospects of us as a society once Gen Z, continue to grow and evolve. So Gen Y have been in a really tough position. They're a huge group just demographically, right? They're an enormous sector of the population in most parts of the world. In Africa, it's over 75% of the population, a very young society. But they've been crunched and hurt by so many things, right? They were entering the workforce during the Great Recession, or just entered the workforce and then the Great Recession hit and then they lost their jobs or contracted their employment prospects. Now, they're amidst COVID-19 as they're trying to accelerate in their careers and managerial careers. And for Gen Z, what we're seeing is this real sense of taking care of one another, of saving. Gen Z are much better savers than Gen Y. Of much more thinking about they're already thinking about how do I build things, right? How do I start saving for a mortgage, save for a car? Because that's the number 2 or number 3 thing that is the most important thing that we can't live without. Whereas Gen Y are kind of more famous for don't own anything, right? Because they kept being disappointed by trying to accumulate and be a consumer society, particularly as their discretionary income kept going through these convulsions and contractions. So Gen Z take a very different view about that. I think they'll be great conservators, caretakers, and maybe be more of the people who build up our societies. Some of our generations are those generations who need to look at, question, and remove, rebuild, tear down elements of society or institutions. Gen Y is in that position. Gen Z will hopefully build on Gen Y's good work and start to think about, so what are the institutions and paradigms that we need to continue to grow and build? And they will hopefully be less of a help us convert to be less of a borrowing society and more of a building and saving society. So on a macro level, they're looking healthier. I hope we as their leaders don't disappoint them in the way I'm afraid we've disappointed many of our Gen Y friends and colleagues.
Thank you. Okay, I think this is going to be our last question, but I'm afraid it's a particularly challenging one for you and I. Some of the intellectual underpinnings of shareholder value have emerged from business schools in the early 1990s. Do you think business schools are part of the problem or part of the solution?
Yeah. So look, that's a great question. I'm very happy to tackle that head on. At different points in over time, business schools have both helped and hurt where we're going. I think now I definitely see a hue and cry for helping us as a society and as a global macroeconomy coming from business schools. So that's A. B, I think universities have a huge part to play in this Renaissance thinking that I was discussing at the very beginning of my presentation, right? This alone makes a great sense for why you need to bring people together and discuss ideas, and often conflicting ideas, and give people as wide perspectives as possible so that they can become critical thinkers instead of ones who are, tyrannical in their thinking. And universities still and will continue to have a huge part to play in that. But we have to think critically, right? And we have to look at the results of what we're learning and be evidence-based rather than based on philosophy. So, what we've learned throughout time is, for example, the World Economic Forum is now showing how we maybe need to think more about where we need to be on the spectrum of how we practice capitalism versus how we create a society focused on wellness and well-being, right? So we need to incorporate that as well as what we're learning from business schools into our thinking. And executive education is in an ideal position to bring in other sectors of society beyond business academia to really create that dialogue to help us as companies and as leaders be the Renaissance thinkers that we so desperately need to be in the 21st century.
That cry to be Renaissance thinkers in the 21st century is a wonderful way to end. Firstly, I want to thank you for just a terrific covering of several hundred years and certainly what's important for the next 100 years. You've covered so much ground. I'd like to thank you for the many questions here. I don't know whether what we're going to do with all these. There's a lot of them, so that'll give us some food for thought about what we do on this. Thank you for joining us. This is part of a series of webinars coming up in a few weeks' time, as you'll see on screen. Is another hugely important area, which is exploring the impact of climate energy and how they work with capital markets. So that's coming up. Thank you for engagement. We're exploring a lot of these topics in many different ways at Imperial, and thank you for the several hundred attendees today in helping us explore this topic. Many thanks. Look forward to seeing you next time.